You ready? I'm wondering. We have a full agenda. We should just press forward.
Okay, good.
All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Dots, hopefully what you came for. And thank you for holding out this long. And I know it's very late in the week. My name is Roman Danilu. I'm here with my co-chair,
Tobias Conram.
Why don't we get started? Next slide, please. So, of course, the NoteWell is still in place. Next slide. Administratively, the blue sheets are going around. Please do make sure you sign them. And thank you for the volunteers for the Jabber Scribe and the note taking. Next slide, please. We have a relatively full agenda. If you saw it on the mailing list kind of previously about a week ago, there's been quite a lot of iterations. Things fell off and were added, and quite a lot of new drafts were pushed out. So the version numbers may be a little bit off, but that is the latest information. We're going to talk about our working group documents. Then we have a number of individual drafts covering information models and solutions drafts. Would anyone like to bash this agenda? Okay, I see no one, so let's proceed then. A quick summary of where we stand. Since we last got together in ITF 96, we had a successful virtual interim meeting. I think this is something we're going to continue doing. We also have continued holding design team meetings during the week. So we had two, one to talk about use cases and another one to talk about solutions-oriented drafts. And I have a little bit of a summary there. So for those that couldn't attend, could better understand what that conversation was about. We had updates to all the working group documents. We have 2 updates to individual drafts and 7 new individual drafts into the working group. So to quickly summarize where we stand on drafts, and of course, many of these will be covered in subsequent presentations. So that's where the details, that's where all the details will be, and that's where you can ask kind of questions. We have 3 use case documents. We of course have the use case, the working group document, which consolidates all the use cases we have to date. We also still have some use cases hanging out in the interdomain draft and in the newly submitted telemetry draft. Thinking through how to deal with all these use cases was a big topic at the design meeting, and kind of coming out of it, all the participants there suggested that we need to continue talking through the different use cases, but to drop them into the common draft. And at the time, the thinking was that certain changes would be made, especially editorial, with -03 if possible. So thanks to the hard work of the editorial team, I believe that they actually published it late last night. So late-breaking changes on where we stand with the use case document that I'm sure Roland is going to fill us in a couple of minutes. Now, the information model, that idea is kind of relatively new. This is a draft introduced since we last got together, and we discussed it a little bit at the virtual interim in September. And then late-breaking, there's also an information model related to telemetry data that we're going to be talking about in subsequent presentations. A lot of activity in the solutions area. The way we have been squinting at it, there are 5 collections of solutions now in flight in the working group as part of various individual drafts. Some solutions are a couple of drafts, some are interrelated. They span both the signal channel and the data channel sometimes. Sometimes they're focused on only parts of the channel. And of course, as you can see, there's a diversity in transport protocols and encoding. So coming into the design meeting, there were three of those teams present. I mean, that was, I think, the biggest question to discuss. There are a lot of different solutions out there. How do we get to the point of talking about a working group solution? So there was agreement amongst all the participants that the data models of all the different respective solutions had a significant amount of overlap. There were not a tremendous number of differences there, and that the thinking with the data channel, again, was relatively close, given that a common transport and a common encoding was chosen by almost all the different solutions teams. The teams that were present there agreed to revise their drafts in the next revision or two. What they'll do is take a lot of the text they have related to information models and pull that out and put that into a common document. And we're going to talk more about that when it's time to talk about the information model. And in discussing, pun intended here, what the draft architecture will look like. So how should we compose all the different things we need to say across the documents? All the different teams suggested that an information model would be a good thing to have. Documents on a per channel basis would be equally good to have, and that we would need at least one transport document, potentially more than one. And so, again, this is just a conversation among the team that was there. We should continue this conversation here in the working group. Lastly, there has been some late-breaking feedback about how DOTS should interrelate to everything else that's happening in the IETF. We're using kind of standards and other things in the security area. So the thread about what's the relationship between NetConf, RESTConf, I2NSF, and how to bridge that with what we're doing here in DOTS kind of came up, but a lot more discussion is going to be required there. So I put this up there only to remind everyone that we have some milestones. So we're supposed to be done with all the non-protocol documents effectively this month. And as it relates to our protocol documents, we're supposed to have that done coming into Chicago. That's probably not going to happen. So just pointing that out there. And as we go into talking about the individual drafts, this will be one question we will ask of kind of all the editor teams about what they think should be the new milestone relative to that. And then I just point out one thing added there. You see in late January, we're going to have another virtual interim meeting just between now and Chicago to have an opportunity to kind of checkpoint on where we stand. As usual, a doodle poll will be put out to make sure that we have the time that works best for the maximum number of people. Okay, so that summarizes roughly where we stand. And I see Fleming coming up to the mic.
Yeah, Fleming Andreas, if you can just put the previous slide back up. Just a question for the chairs. Do you still want to try and sequence the deliverables as you have shown here? And in particular, what I was thinking about was the use cases and requirements, try to get those wrapped up before we continue all the work on the other stuff. Yes.
Actually, we did not have the objective to sequence the events from the beginning. The idea was like they should be finished earlier, but to proceed with all work in parallel, because maybe some stuff will feed back into a use case if there's some modifications needed. So it's more coincidental than intended, maybe.
Okay, so there is, if I can paraphrase that, there's not a requirement to get these wrapped up here, right now.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All right, thank you.
But we do hope that they can, be very
Understood.
mature by the time that we do the protocol discussions.
Yep, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so that's really just a quick summary of where we stand. The rest of the time we have is talking about the details of all of that. So first up is Roland Dobbins. Roland Dobbins is going to talk about where we stand with a very new use case document, revised, hot off the presses late last night again.
Okay, super. Thank you. Microphone's on. Hi, I'm Roland Dobbins with Arbor Networks, and we just got a new revision out, 03 of the use cases. Next slide, please. So we were able to achieve our earlier goal of getting the inter-domain use cases structure in some of the content integrated with the main use cases draft. We refactored the document significantly. If you'll recall, the use cases 00 and 01 were very, very micro-analytical in nature, looking at repetitive interactions between DOTS clients and servers and gateways and so forth. We retained that, but we moved it back to an appendix, and we have a lot more descriptive verbiage now to really set context, especially for folks who are new to DDoS in general and DOTS in particular. We have gone with a lot more high-level description than we had before. The intent was, again, to make this entire realm more accessible to non-specialists, and I think that we achieved that goal. Many thanks to the draft team and to our co-chairs for helping us get that done this week. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of things that we still need to do. There's a lot of grammatical stuff that we still need to clean up and so forth. That's just really details. Now that we have the high-level descriptive and contextual language in the draft, we need to go ahead and take the very detailed communications model use cases that are in Appendix A. Appendix A is what used to be 00 and 01, and write those out in more of like almost like a story type of format, so that we describe with more richer detail who is talking to what within a given DOTS communication chain. And so that's on there for 04. We need to streamline the prose style. We have multiple folks who contributed verbiage to 03, and so we need to do some overwriting and make sure that the prose style and the terminology is consistent. We definitely have to make sure that all of our terminology is harmonized with the other main working group drafts. And we need to get 04 out. So work on 04 starts pretty much immediately. And our goal here is to get enough of this done here that's listed on the slide, so that 04 can be a viable working group last call candidate. Next slide. And again, I just wanted to thank everybody who's working on use cases. We had a really good team effort, contributions from everybody on the team. And again, thanks to the chairs for their support.
Thank you guys, and thanks everybody on the team. Yep.
The questions, and the usual question we always ask is, are there any other use cases that are floating around that are not documented in the interdomain draft, in the telemetry draft, or in the working group document you just heard about?
Fleming Andreessen, it's kind of hard to answer, right? The draft was just submitted, so we'll have to defer judgment on that, I think.
Okay.
Maybe if you do have them, let us know in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Definitely before the interim, because by that time, I think we need to wrap this. Any other questions?
In that case, thanks, Roland.
Okay, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Next one is our requirements update.
Good morning. This is just a brief update on where the requirements draft currently stands. This is going to be fairly brief. The changes have not been dramatic between the 02 and 03 revisions, and the reason for that will be quite apparent on the last slide. So one of the notable changes is that we moved the requirement the session configuration be done in the data channel. Following the last meeting, there was fairly broad consensus that the session configuration parameters should be done during channel init time for the signal channel, for both endpoints to agree on things like the acceptable signal loss, the heartbeat interval, and the maximum mitigation lifetime. So this is no longer in the data 003 requirement. May I have the next slide, please? Here's a typo. That should actually be SEC 002. But again, at the last meeting, when we were talking about the move from the DOTS relay as a separate entity to the logical concatenation of a DOTS server and a DOTS client to form up the DOTS gateway, we were calling it an analog to a B2B UA from SIP. And someone, and I'm forgetting who, unfortunately, pointed out that we needed to make it a hard requirement that any interface between the DOTS server and DOTS client forming the DOTS gateway needed to be secure. So we've made that stipulation here, and that can be just, they have the same security context running on the same machine or virtual machine, but it could also mean that they have some sort of secure interface between containerized DOTS server and DOTS client, or on separate physical machines. Next slide, please. Just a couple updates to the data model requirements reflecting the change from the data 03, where we moved the session configuration parameters into the signal channel. So we've just added the requirement that the data model have the acceptable signal loss and the heartbeat interval, and just moved one of the existing data model requirements. Next slide. So there's not much remaining work. I think the security requirements could probably use a review. They haven't been touched, I think, since the 00 revision. So I think they should probably be updated to reflect additional working group feedback, and also to incorporate some of the other the security considerations that we've added to some of the other related documents. we'd like to ask the working group if it feels there are additional changes that need to be made as a result of some of the individual drafts that have come out recently. Do you want to ask your question now, Fleming, or do you want to wait? Okay. And finally, we are getting close to working group last call, so I'd like to hear from the working group whether it feels that we are ready to move forward with that. Good. Thank you.
So Fleming and Andreessen, so one thing that I think is missing, and this will not come as a surprise, is a distinction between what do we consider mandatory requirements versus things that might not be mandatory for every single implementation. I think we're struggling a little bit with that in some of the discussions that are going on in the group right now.
Yeah.
And I think we got to get some clarity around that. And I think the requirements is a very good place to start with that.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe a question to the room, as he was asking, like more feedback could be beneficial. Who has read the draft, the recent requirements draft? Okay. Who is willing to still read the draft in addition in the next few weeks? Okay, that's a couple of hands. And provide feedback. I'm specifically saying this after you raise your hands. Okay, that's good. So that means, yeah, that's a good sign when we get like about 10 people I counted here to provide feedback on this. It would be good. What's your timeline for the next revision?
Oh, I think we can make some very rapid progress here.
Okay.
The feedback is really what we've been missing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Should we say before the interim?
shall we say before Christmas, so he has time to make a revision before the interim?
Take his holidays away.
Yeah. Okay. If there's no objections, so it would be good if you could provide your feedback in the next 6 weeks, and then we have a chance to put this in the revision for the interim.
Actually, I have a question for Fleming. Fleming, were you thinking that the requirements draft would then be informed by the information model discussion, and sort of have a little feedback loop going there where we'd end up marking certain things as optional as opposed to mandatory?
Yeah, so Fleming and Andreessen again. Yeah, I think that would be ideal, right? Because there would certainly always start with it in the requirements, but at the end of the day, right, I mean, it's largely the same group of people, and it might be, as you're alluding to as well, be a little bit more informed if we iterate between the information model and the requirements.
Okay, thanks.
Good. Thank you very much. Then we have the next architecture update.
All right, it's still me, Andrew Mortensen, Over Networks. So we have an update on the working group DOTS architecture. Next slide. So there have been some additional minor changes that I don't have highlighted here, but they are largely some just word choice things. So the major difference in this revision is the addition of some Anycast considerations, which I'll get into in some depth, and an additional clarification around what constitutes a fully active signal channel. Next slide, please. We'll start by talking about the active signal channel. So in the wake of the migration of session configuration parameters out of the data channel, we decided that the architecture draft was not clear enough about what constituted an active signaling session. And one of the very important things here is that the DOTS agents agree they find mutually acceptable the session configuration that's being proposed by the client. So we tried to clarify that, and if the agents are not able to come to a mutually acceptable configuration, the protocol needs to be able to handle that and either terminate the session or provide some sort of alert. Next slide, please.
It might be good to be closer to the mic. I'm not sure whether, can you hear us in the back? So maybe.
All right, let me
Okay.
tilt this up a little bit. All right. So the Anycast work was proposed during the meeting in Berlin in the wake of a discussion around DOTS redirected signaling. Just to remind the working group, the redirected signaling is this idea that a DOTS client might either have an established signaling session with a DOTS server or try to connect and establish a signal session with the DOTS server and gets pointed to a different DOTS server by the one it has been talking to. There are some operational challenges around that, particularly redirection under attack conditions, and so Anycast was proposed as a possible alternative, so we started investigating that. Next slide, please. In the course of looking into DOTS Anycast signaling, we kind of identified 3 possible use cases, which are enumerated here. the service discovery, the sort of per customer regional deployment for DOTS, and the operational resiliency. Next slide, please. The Anycast service discovery is actually a pretty useful case for us. RFC 7094 is the Anycast architectural considerations document. And in that document, an instance discovery mechanism is described in which an Anycast service address is made available. And a client connects to that service address and is redirected to a unicast address that has a stable network path. And that makes a lot of sense for a DOTS deployment where a domain might make an Anycast DOTS service address available. A DOTS client connects to it and is immediately redirected to a nearby or at least a DOTS server that has a stable network path to it, unicast network path. Next slide, please. There is a but with the other two. The service discovery makes a lot of sense for us, but the further we looked into these other two with DOTS, the more difficult it looked to us. Next slide. A lot of operational challenges around this. Signaling sessions in DOTS are ideally long-lived. You don't want to be trying to establish your security context under attack conditions. And I do realize that not everyone is going to have a DOTS deployment where the link between the DOTS client and server will be congested with attack traffic, but it is an important consideration for us. So if the DOTS client and server have an established signaling session, it's very easy for the DOTS client to just say help, rather than saying I'm under attack and having to establish, go through a full DTLS handshake, for example. If we have a DOTS Anycast deployment and there is an established signaling session and there's the network configuration changes causing some instability in the network path, the DOTS client may end up directing its signal to a DOTS server that doesn't have the security state that it had established with the previous DOTS server. That could ultimately lead to a sort of signal session flapping, where the DOTS client finds itself connecting to different DOTS servers. The network configuration changes such that the Anycast service address is now has a different network path. And unless somehow the security state is being shared among all those DOTS servers that share the Anycast service address, you end up with the DOTS client trying to reestablish signaling sessions and spending all of its time trying to recover the session rather than being able to perform the DOTS mechanisms. Next slide, please. We do have not considerable remaining work, but some important stuff, I think. We've agreed among the architecture design team that a service discovery section would be valuable. Primarily these three up here, the SRV, DNSSD, and the Anycast instance discovery. The redirected signaling considerations, I think, are probably still worth visiting. As we've investigated the Anycast stuff, it's become apparent that it is not a panacea for redirected signaling. So we'd appreciate some working group feedback on redirection. We would like to hear from the working group whether discussion of provisioning for DOTS clients would be valuable in the architecture. We've alluded to things like DANE. I have an individual draft that suggests using enrollment over secure transport, but if the working group thinks this is important, I think we could proceed with that. Finally, the equal cost multipath was proposed by Nick Teague as sort of a subset of the Anycast considerations. I hope I didn't misrepresent what you were saying. And he's volunteered to bring forward some text for addition to the draft. And finally, if there are other changes outstanding that the working group thinks are worth adding to the document, we'd appreciate hearing about it. Thanks.
Comment, Roland Dobbins, Arbor Networks. I understand the general gist of the thinking on Anycast, but I think it might be useful to game through that a little bit more, because I'm trying to think in my mind here, and in most DOTS deployments that I can emphasize, the likelihood of routing disruption is equally probable for a net block that happens to be Anycasted versus one that isn't. There's been, over the years, a lot of myths propagated about Anycast, like, Anycast is not suitable for TCP. The reality is that Anycast works very well with TCP-based services, and there's a lot of Anycast deployment out there of TCP-based services. So maybe let's just if we could just game through the Anycast thing one more time. Now, I do agree that Anycast is not a panacea for some form of intelligent redirection if the working group decides that intelligent redirection is something that we want to pursue. But Anycast has lots of resiliency benefits, aside from the redirection use case. So let's make sure that we get together at some point on a con call or something and kind of game through this and make sure that we all have a good picture in our heads of implications of Anycast for dots.
I will say that we did not end up landing on one side or the other in the architecture draft. We did not come down recommending against it. We were really spelling out the operational considerations that needed to be taken into account before going forward with a dots Anycast deployment.
It had Bob Moskowitz, and the big one you pointed out there is the security implications of how you have a security context pre-established in the attack scenario so that you can trust it. Otherwise, you go to secure data objects with the cost and the attacks of secure data objects. So I think we can go down the path and analyze it, but I think that the security may be one of the biggest barriers to such an approach.
Fleming Andreasen. Yeah, Roland, just to your request. So there was a lot of discussion between the authors, which I don't think we really posted on the mailing list. So maybe what we should do, I don't know, should we just, have a conversation with you? Should we capture that in a short draft, just outline what some of the issues were that we thought of, and then we can see if there's a
How
way
about we
of
put it on the
addressing
mailing list?
We could do that.
Can we do that?
Yeah, Roland Diamonds Our Networks. Actually, so that we don't end up typing novels back and forth together on the mailing list, I think this is a very dense discussion. So I think it would be more appropriate if we could have some kind of con call and then summarize to the list. And we can, and folks can still contribute on the list as well, but there's a need for, I think, a lot of dense verbal discussion as well.
I think we're good whatever way in whatever way that brings the content ultimately to the mailing list, so the entire working group can benefit from it.
Hi, Nick Teague. I think on the Anycast discussion is that some of the considerations and everything are deployment specific and operational considerations versus actual something to do with the protocol. There are considerations regarding security, maintaining state across multiple instances, but there are ways to overcome that within organizations and stuff. So I think some of them are a lot more operational considerations, and we shouldn't kind of get too deep in the weeds of doing this. I do think we should call out the considerations and then if somebody wants to try and implement it, let them go into it personally. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, I will say that we also took a look at the DNS over DTLS draft that's out there, and in many ways they have some sort of superficial resemblances. The real concern was really about trying to reestablish a signaling session under attack conditions. If the signaling session, if the network configuration changes such that you end up talking to a different dot server, and you're not under attack, it's not really that big a deal, right? It's just another handshake to set up a security context.
Roland Evans, Our Networks. And on the redirection front, the original thinking behind redirection was that there may be reasons that a dot server would want to tell a dots client go talk to somebody else, for example, an outage related to the dots and the back end DDoS mitigation infrastructure, or a capacity issue, something like that. And so that's was the original thinking behind redirection. And so I almost believe that at least in most cases that I can think of, that redirection would need to be, quote, intelligent in nature, would need to be informed redirection versus more of a blind redirection based on routing. So for whatever that's worth.
We'll sprinkle some fairy dust on the dot server.
All right, very good. Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Okay, so moving on in the agenda, it's now time to talk about the information model. So Fleming.
Dots information and data model. If you want to go to the next slide, please. Basically, what we said in the last meeting was that we need, and can you see the slides? We need an information and data model. And what we have really seen mostly so far has been data models. There is a variety of different protocol drafts out there. And it kind of gets intertwined between, what is the specific protocol that I want to choose and what are the elements that I actually end up putting in there. So in the last meeting in Berlin, we identified the need for coming up with a draft that would actually tease these apart. And I think we talked about it as a data model that also matches what we have in terms of the milestones. And we had some discussion back and forth, do we really need an information model? And we said, well, we probably need a little bit in there. So I volunteered to take a look at that. And we put together a 0.0 draft that we presented at the DOTS interim meeting in September. What that really was, most of all, was going through the existing requirements that we had, the architecture documents, the use cases, and trying to figure out what are the types of information that we need, what are the types of message exchanges that we need, and then essentially have an inventory of that. Did not have a whole lot of detail for that so far. Next slide, please. The current draft is essentially building on that, so starting to provide more detail around what does this information and data model actually look like. So in order to figure out what kind of information and data model elements we actually need, what we did was try to take a step back and say, all right, we need to have an idea about what are the kinds of message exchanges that we really need. So to that extent, we came up with what we call a logical API, essentially, where we try to capture these exchanges that we thought were needed, the different interaction styles that were needed, request response, notification, etc. And then based on that, say for each of these, what are the types of information that we think is actually needed? And then call those out as specific information elements. The current draft is mostly looking at the actual message exchanges and identifying the types of information elements that are needed in there, the details as to what those individual information elements actually look like. That's to be done by far. Next slide. In terms of the overall outline of the document, there's the typical, introductory stuff. And then there is a section around information model. That's where there's some content in. And then there's a section, placeholder section for the data model. And then your typical IANA security consideration section, et cetera, at the end. The more we look at this, the more it seems like what we actually need at this point is an information model, right? Something that is protocol agnostic and that really focuses on, all right, what are the types of information that we need? So I think where the authors are landing right now, and we had some discussions in the design team yesterday about that as well, is that this document should probably be an information model document, actually. It should not really get into the data model. So right now, the expectation is that the data model section is essentially going to disappear. Once we get into what specific protocol we actually want to use, well, we'll obviously have a translation or a mapping from the information model that we're defining into a specific data model for those protocols. Next slide. So giving a little bit more information about what we actually have in the information model sections right now. There is, I think, 4 subsections right now. A general section that tries to establish an overall framework. As I was mentioning before, the interaction styles that are needed, request response, notification, etc. Coming up with a little bit of structure around this whole modularity aspect, as I was alluding to with the requirements before. There's a certain set of functionality that's going to be mandatory to implement, and then there are going to be things that are probably going to be optional to implement, but that are still considered part of what we would call the baseline specification. And then this notion of extensions. We have a wide variety of potential attack target types. That could be all kinds of information that you want to exchange. We want to try to not go overboard, I think, initially with the DOTS deliverables. So having a somewhat focused scope, and hence, be clear as to, what's actually mandatory, what's optional, and what do we want to deal with later on in the form of extensions. It could also happen in parallel, but we're not necessarily going to hold up progress on this stuff. I think that's key. So that's essentially what we're driving at there with the modularity aspect. DOTS agent identity is another thing that's called out. I have that as an open issue, something that requires more discussion as to exactly what that is and whether we even need it. And then a little bit around server discovery, versioning, and message correlation, etc. I think, as I was mentioning on one of the other slides, some of these you could argue maybe that's getting a little bit into protocol specifics. In some cases, I think that's true. We haven't, completely teased that apart correctly, I think, right now. We'll look more at that as we hopefully mature this document. Section 3.2 gets into these conceptual signal channel messages, again, in the form of a logical API. Again, this is not something anybody has to implement. This is really just to get your state of mind around what is it that we're trying to do, and again, provide a framework for the information elements that we see a need to exchange and how all of that is going to work, including modularity considerations. Next slide. Data channel, similarly, again, this is a little bit simpler because there is not that much to deal with in there. The focus there is really going to be more on the information elements. And going back to some of the points that were made earlier, there's a request right now to see, all right, at least for the data channel, does it actually make sense to consider coming up with, especially here for the data channel, in a Yang model and maybe leveraging NetConf and RESTconf. You know, we'll look at that separately. The information model, of course, is not going to make a determination as to the actual protocol we're going to be using, but we'll take a look at what is the best way of actually modeling all of this. And then finally, section 3.4, the action information elements, is really just an inventory right now. Next version of the document will hopefully have a lot more detail around what is actually inside of those information elements, including which ones do we consider optional, which ones are mandatory, what's the extension structure behind all of those. Next slide. Open issues. Before we get into that, how are we doing on time?
Good. We are good.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time? All right. So there's a number of editor's notes in the document right now, basically calling out things that we weren't really sure about. We just made a note of it right now just to try to get something out there for review. So some of these I just wanted to highlight here in the next couple of slides, and we can see if people have any thoughts on those right now. If not, and depending on, again, how much time we have, you know, we can take that basically on the mailing list and or in follow-up discussions. Next slide, please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So the first one is around this whole notion of mandatory versus optional versus extension. We don't really know exactly what is required by everybody to implement. I was mentioning this in the requirements right now, and I think that's got to be a big focus of what we do here in the next versions, including for the requirements. Some people feel that, you know, we should have, for example, telemetry being a requirement. You know, what about the different types of attack targets that we have? You know, is it just IP based? Is it URI based? Is it E164? All of that stuff, right? What is baseline functionality? What do you have to support? We got to get some clarity around that. In order to get to that, the proposal that I'm making here is that in the requirements, in the use cases, and in the information/data model, which is really going to be an information model, we got to be very clear around this. And I think it makes sense to have the requirements document being the driver of that. But also, I think per the comment that Andrew made earlier, it is probably going to be a little bit of an iterative process. As we go through and examine the use cases a little bit more, as we look at the message exchanges, we'll have to come to some common ground as what do we really consider baseline functionality and get that aligned between the two. But I think that's got to be a significant focus of the work here going forward. What I would also say in terms of what actually does go into these documents, there has been questions or requests, for example, saying, you know, we should include telemetry as an example. There could be other things as well. We should include telemetry in all of these documents. There are different views in the group right now as to whether the telemetry use case is something that is required or not. So again, depending on where we land with that, I would say, as a general guideline, what we want to put in the immediate deliverable documents right now should focus on what I have termed here mandatory and optional, but not extensions. Extensions is something that you deal with separately in separate documents. That goes for, you know, use cases, requirements, protocol details, etc. So let me pause there and ask for comments and feedback. No comment means agreement.
At least no violent disagreement.
Yeah.
So please feel free to continue.
Roland up as our networks. I agree.
Any other comments? All right. Let's move to the next slide then. Issue 2. I mentioned the DOTS agent ID earlier. There is an open question in my mind around at least what I have called the DOTS identity model. We had this notion of DOTS domains We know that we need to do mutual authentication of DOTS agents. We have an assumption, I think, right now that we will be running on top of TLS and DTLS, depending on the underlying transport. And the question is, all right, so what does that mean from an authentication and authorization perspective, and also considering operational requirements? Do we need at the DOTS level to have something explicit that identifies what is the entity that I'm actually communicating with at this point in time? I don't think we have clarity on that. I do think at some level that we need it. I haven't been able to articulate, a lot of strong arguments as to why that is. I think you can come up with operational considerations, etc. If we do have it, of course, there's a lot of questions as to, okay, exactly what does it look like, and how do you actually make sure that it is tied to the proper authentication and authorization model underneath, including things like DTLS, for example.
See my presentation coming up.
Name, please, next time.
Roland Dobbins, Arbor Networks. I don't see how DOTS could be usable from an operational perspective without it, agent IDs, because I think it's very necessary in order to track things like the provisioning and countermeasures, protections, whatever you want to call them, that are associated with a given endpoint organization that requires DDoS mitigation assistance with individual services, with individual applications. The contractual stuff, if there's a commercial relationship involved, I don't see how the system would be usable without the agent ID.
I think the argument that has been made is that if you have a certificate already that has identity information in it, you can just leverage that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we want to necessarily depend on that. I think that we need to have a way to explicitly configure an agent ID, and that there may be different schemas that different organizations want to use for various reasons. So I'm not sure we want to tie ourselves to the certificate only.
Bob Moskowitz again. I'm more than happy, and plus I plan on doing this, and thus to lead anybody who wants to form a team on this particular subject area. I do have a large bit of experience in this up and down the stack, so I will take this particular item on.
Appreciate that. What would your view be right now?
I very strongly back Roland on a domain of trust inside a business model. And not to use, say, any specific identity created in some other context. I can go on in this in terms of trust leakage in various models. I've lived this for somewhere in excess of 20 years, and I've seen lots of bad things done. And I'd like to see good things done here. So I have a particular viewpoint. I got my Kevlar armor on, and we'll take it as it goes.
All right.
Kathleen Moriarty, AD. So I might have missed it. What does DOTS level mean?
It means at the application level.
At the application level. Okay. So my only caution would just be as you proceed to consider privacy and implications of any type of identifier. And I think the RFC is 6973. Is that right, Adrian? Do you remember? Ish. So it's around there. 6973 it's probably right. I'm usually good about numbers, but we do have to consider that.
All right. Thank you. Any other comments on this one?
Andrew Mortensen, Arbor Networks. It occurs to me that we have not actually addressed the issue of revoking access as well, not in the architecture, not in the requirements, that the DOTS server be able to deny access to a DOTS client for various reasons.
Okay. Yep. Any other comments? All right. Next slide, please. Some other issues that we noted in there. There are a few additional ones in, above and beyond what we have here, but these were just worth calling out. Andrew already talked about one of these, to Anycast and or redirect. That is the question, and it seems that is still the question.
I believe this is a false dichotomy. I believe that Anycast or redirection I don't see a compare contrast between the two. I think that they each have benefits in that one does not obviate the other. So the and part here is the model that I agree with conceptually.
Yeah, okay. So maybe I would actually suggest that we put together a very short draft at this point, just capturing some considerations around Anycast.
I'm going to read this from Jabba. I don't know if it was intended for the mic or not. Oh, he's finally responded. No, it wasn't intended for the mic. Right, I'll go away.
You can read it anyway.
No, really, read it now.
Now we are curious. Okay.
All right. Another one around redirection is we have this signal channel and we have a data channel. And if you redirect one of them, what does that mean to the other one? It's not really clear.
Roland Dobbins, Arbor Networks, as Nick pointed out earlier, right? There are different ways to how do I say this from an operational perspective? It may well be possible, it may well be desirable to redirect them independently or redirect one and not the other. I can think of scenarios in which that would make sense. So again, I think we need more discussion to bring clarity to light here. I think it would be relatively rare that you'd want to do it independently, but I can think of some reasons, some scenarios in which you might want to do that. So we need to talk through that and figure out whether it makes sense, whether redirection makes sense. And if redirection makes sense, does it make sense to do the additional work or have the additional complexity, I guess is a better way of putting it, of allowing for independent redirection of signaling and data, or if we should just view them as a bonded pair.
Okay. So for now, if we wanted to take an approach and go forward with, it sounds like we should not couple them. Let's try to ensure that yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I'm leaning to as well, but I was looking for more feedback.
David Olson, Sandvine. It just seems as a general principle not to require them to be to the same endpoint.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Which would mean redirection would be independent as well.
Yep.
A question about the redirection Anycast. If you always expect redirect to point you to the real server, isn't that just DNS? Doesn't that just fill your requirement?
I don't believe so, no.
No, is it different than that?
Yeah, because you can't really control that, right?
Well, I mean, DNS is a single message to an Anycast address, and it gives you an answer to where you need to talk to. I just wonder how this is different than that.
It's different because you want to do it, actively, and you may want to do it after the signal channel has already been established.
Okay, so maybe something that happens later. Okay.
Yep. Nick?
Hi, Nick Teague. My opinion is that we should allow redirection decoupled, either or and both. Just there are various cases. I might, after provisioning, want to send signals a different direction because I've got a server here that's well known, but I've got a bunch of ingest, and I might just want to redeploy it in different locations or different regions or something like that. Or I might just want to have this is your enrollment IP. Again, well known, and then everything else goes over here, and that's your data channel and your signaling channel. So that's the way I kind of see it progressing.
All right, and that may actually help clarify another question that I think we had maybe in the interim. I don't remember, as to do we actually need to have both a signal channel and a data channel, right? Certainly, if you see use cases for them going to separate places, that would advocate for that.
All right, this one really is from Jabba. Why can't recursive signaling be used to avoid redirection during attack time?
So we essentially have gotten rid of recursive signaling as something that is explicitly supported by the DOTS protocol, because it ends up introducing a lot of complexities. Because now you have to consider, just take the identity, for example, right? What is the identity that I pass through? What are the authentication and authorization aspects? What are the things that I can actually control here administratively? So we essentially we had previously this notion of DOTS relays that would effectively support the recursive signaling explicitly. Now, what you're saying from a DOTS protocol point of view, we don't really want to deal with all those complexities. You can still support it in the form of a DOTS gateway, but it would be something that's implementation specific above and beyond the DOTS protocol itself. All right, other issues, of course, is just getting all the details filled in for the various information elements as well. And if you go through the document, then you will see various editors' notes sprinkled throughout, and I'm sure there will be many more as we start refining everything. I think that's it for no, actually, there's one more slide. All right. So question for the group, I guess. First of all, how many people have actually looked at this document? All right. The people that have looked at it, I mean, does it look like this is on the right track? Yes? No? Okay.
Could I ask the opinion in the other way? I mean, does someone is there any kind of opinion in the group that having an information model is not the right way to drive some of the protocol work?
So, sorry for interjecting. When he asked about who read the draft, I saw like about 5-6 hands go up. That's not so many. Let me add a second question. So considering that, who is interested in reading that draft and providing feedback who hasn't done so yet in the next few weeks? That's also not many. That's like 5-ish. So, okay, maybe. Yes. Yeah, well, okay. But you know, if it doesn't happen in the next few weeks, it will never happen. So there was a question in the audience, like next few weeks will be busy in the security space, but like, yeah. That's a constant state of mind to some degree. So the thing is, in the design team meeting, at least for Roman and myself and the people in the room, we had the impression that this information model would be really helpful to consolidate the protocol path. But I also note that like not many people have read and reviewed this. In theory, this might be okay if it is a tool to help inform the protocol development. But equally, I'm looking at the AD at some point as well, whether that is acceptable. And I see a comment here in the room, please.
One of the open issues and many of the inline editorial requests for comment are around whether this is bleeding into protocol. And I think that would be a very easy thing for people to provide feedback on, whether they think it's getting too specific. So that would probably be a very low barrier to entry for comment on this.
Could you state your question to me again? I caught everything but the question to me. So
Oh,
sorry.
I apologize. So we felt that okay. My impression was in the design team that this would be a really helpful tool to help funnel down the protocol discussion. I think from our perspective as the co-chairs, we would be willing to go ahead with this even with not so many reviews as a tool to guide us. But I'm looking also to you for your guidance or advice.
Right. So I guess there's a few questions then. Will this hold up additional work? Will it slow things down? Will it be super helpful to make sure that we actually get to an end state? Other working groups. So there's a number of working groups that deal with protocols, information models, and data models. And one in particular gets very held up on this topic and is going to take eons to complete their work. So will that happen by going too deep in this, or do you keep this as guiding principles and not as a draft that gets published?
Maybe I'm stepping ahead now, but also stepping back in time of the agenda today. So you have seen Roman present at the beginning. We have a number of protocol drafts that have a significant overlap, at least in agreement as an agreed assessment by the different authors. And of course, we have to narrow them down. And this would be a good tool in the way to do that. Another tool would be to let them all run in parallel and make a beauty contest at some point.
So I guess two questions. Are there regional differences that would dictate different solutions in different regions because of the attack type seen? I was at a presentation yesterday, and Korea had their first major DDoS attack recently. Their first major one, right? So, is that something that has to get factored into the number of solutions selected, right? Because maybe there's regional differences in what's being seen. And what was I had a second comment. It'll come back to me, but it looks like Roland wants to respond on that one. So go ahead.
Yeah, Roland Evans, Over Networks. No, there are no regional differences in
Are
whoever
you sure? Do you work in China too?
globally. Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
There are no regional differences, and whoever was saying that Korea just suffered its first major DDoS attack is sadly misinformed.
Okay, it was all the Korean security standard reps, so it was major for them.
They-
So maybe their perception of this and the impact is different than the impact that you've seen for other DDoS attacks that they've seen.
I work attacks in Korea and in this region all the time, and there have been major DDoS attacks in Korea. Korea is a hyper-connected society.
Let's not argue about this.
Okay.
Kind of pointless.
So maybe let me answer to one question, and I'm going out on a limb now as still keeping my working group chair head on, but like not deeply coordinated. So from the discussion in the design team meeting, I have the impression that this will not have an adverse effect on the speed of the working group progress. Because you asked, will this hold us up? I do not think so. Actually, in fact, I believe it will help facilitate us make progress. Well, fast is a strong word, but in a good way. Yes. So
Okay,
that
good.
maybe to answer your question.
Good. Then it's really up to the working group and chairs to make this consensus call. And then if there's arguments, then I can step in and help again. But I just wanted to ask that question so that work doesn't get held up and that consideration was made up front.
Okay.
Or considered up front.
Yes, I led two more comments, and then I think I make a comment. Yeah.
Hi, Nick Teague. I just wanted to highlight the point that in the meeting when with Roman's breaking out of the various solutions. I mean, there was two basic types there. One was based on telemetry, and the other was based on signaling telemetry. Another one, and everything else is based on pretty much signaling the DDoS stuff. Where it's actually signaling the DDoS requirements, there's a whole ton of overlap. We're all using similar terms, doing similar things. We're just maybe calling them different, somewhat different elements, but overall the elements are all the same. There's a ton of overlap in both channels. So I think from the standpoint of it being useful, yes, I think it would be really good to help us all define on a common language and common terminology across that. Will it hold things up? No, I don't think so, because I think with the commonality across the various solutions, we're not really coming from all those many different directions. I think there's a bunch of consolidation we can do amongst ourselves, and I think that was borne out from the discussions we had yesterday. So as far as and for what we actually discussed and looking at the various solutions, I don't think regionality comes into it. It's just going to be scale of application and so on. So, so on that, I would be for keeping the document, adopting it, whatever, and working on bringing this, and just to inform the protocols, and even if it's just the protocol designers who are looking at it, then that, for me, that's valuable.
So from Jabba, Andrew Sullivan is committing to review. And then hat change, Adrian Farrell. Please don't try to use the information model to help resolve the beauty contest. It will make it worse.
Actually, Tobias Gondrom as working group co-chair, our intent is not to resolve the beauty contest. Our intent is to resolve convergence.
Fine.
So yeah, hopefully we don't have a beauty contest, or not that, but we can narrow down each topic individually. Yes. Well, okay. Handsome contest. Is that better? No. Okay. Good. Do you no? Okay. So then we proceed. Do you have more points? No. Okay. Good. Then we move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much. No. This is
Nick's up.
Yeah. I believe next one is Nick.
I just want to check, where are the blue sheets? I'm holding one.
And And has everybody signed the blue sheets? Maybe we should let them go around one more time.
Hi, I'm Nick Teague. The first slide. So we put forward a solutions draft, a protocol draft that is based on our experience and some of our concerns that we've mentioned in the working group, but maybe we didn't feel it actually been addressed yet. And we wanted to kind of put this together as a model for what we see as a potential path to go down. We wanted to emphasize a low barrier to entry. We didn't want to kind of mire it in so many complexities and so many complex solutions or implementations that are very vendor specific or anything that it would just make it impossible to use, or just in things that people would find difficult. It's easy. We wanted to have rapid tooling. We wanted an emphasis on the signal survivability, which is kind of like common across everything we've been discussing forever. We wanted also emphasis on extensibility and compatibility, because if we can be extensible and backwardly compatible and so on, then we solve a lot of the problems. As far as extensibility goes, then all these telemetry issues and everything else kind of go away because it's just extensions or options or whatever. We wanted to be transport agnostic because we didn't want to go down. We didn't want to just stand there having a fight over, well, we should use UDP, no, we should use TCP. Just use whatever you want. It's the best. If we'll specify, here's the protocol, use UDP and DTLS, use TCP and TLS, use whatever works for you, and agree on it with your upstream or your peer. And we wanted to kind of like express again the idea of the minimum viable capability, which Roland is I don't want to say been banging on about, but he has been banging on about it. Yeah. Next slide, please. So the minimal viable capability is a mouthful, but it basically relies on just the facts. What are we trying to communicate? What is the bare minimum we need to communicate, and what needs to get, what is there? And this comes back to the discussions that with Fleming and so on, as far as like determining what's mandatory, what is actually going to be mandatory, and what else is optional, and so on. Again, additional needs around telemetry, flow filters, etc. we consider maybe handled by extensions. You just, if you want to exchange filters using this and not flow spec, use this, but do it as an extension. But let everything else that's doing its thing do its thing, and just do that on the side. But I also consider that we can get wrapped up in the discussion on telemetry and all this other stuff and not actually move forward with the protocol. Where I feel we can move forward with the protocol and everything else can go on in parallel or concert or whatever. And we don't need to, one that doesn't need to particularly inform the other. Next slide, please. So for our data channel, we just said, just use REST. It's there, it's easy, everybody knows it. It's common across, and it happens to be common across all our solutions. So I think across the room and across the draft, the solutions draft authors, we can all agree that REST is probably going to be the data channel. It's just comes down to then, what are we going to exchange over that, and what are we going to call it and stuff. Next slide, please. So the crux is the signal channel, and we had a discussion in Buenos Aires with Chris Moreau and Dan Wing and some other people were there, and the word, protobufs came up, and we like the idea. We think the protobufs kind of sits there in the middle between CBOR and some other lower kind of, basically between CBOR and something like IPFix, for example, which is this. And it would provide us with a potential solution that would answer our various concerns. It decouples the schema from the data, which we think adds to efficiency, because then you're not duplicating your schema all the time. Every time you send a message, you're not sending the schema with it. It's quite efficient, compact. Like I said, reduced repetition, allows for a loosely coupled bidirectional messaging, because it's like an IDL, so we can actually use it as a language across there. It's extensible because it is. It's backwards compatible because it is, because it uses numbered fields, but it's not actually a standard, which is sort of the problem with it. So either protobufs would have to be standardized, or we would have to do some kind of wire format that looked like protobufs, and then when protobufs is standardized, we just call it protobufs or whatever. But for now, we're using it. We're continuing to kind of go down this the path just to kind of see where it leads us. Next slide, please. So this is pretty simplistic. I mean, the signal channel is where everything kind of is happening. We have an initialization, which is pretty much straightforward. I mean, you have a handshake, a channel in it which includes various messages like this is what I support, then a heartbeat back with a with a lost or a return message is lost, a return an additional channel in it, and then the heartbeat, and then the signal channel is active. I mean, it's very simple to kind of do. It's just basically a very simple negotiation between the devices exchanging what they support. It's just a few lines of like this is my heartbeat interval, this is my heartbeat frequency, and so on. Size, whatever. Next slide. Where things get interesting is actually in where we see the signaling going. And what we're doing is it's just a series of heartbeats back and forward. It just so happens that in certain other heartbeats we'll add additional information. For the most part, it's very, again, as you can see, it's pretty simple. It's just basically a sequence number, last server sequence number seen, then so you can detect some loss. And this continues indefinitely pretty much during the time that the actual signaling session is active. Next slide. The client signal, just to give a representation, this is what a mitigation signal would be, again, very compact. On the right side is a schema that would actually have to appear in protobufs, and then as far as the schema goes, and then on the left side is just a JSON representation of what kind of data would be passed there. Very simple. You have an event ID. Requested 1 means that mitigation has been requested. If it was 0, it wouldn't be. It would be terminated. A scope such as protected network, protected host, lifetime. Efficacy is kind of a bit of a number just to say, well, this is how effective we believe existing countermeasures have been, but and then extensions such as, I know, attack profile could be GRE, vendor could be Acme, whatever. Next slide, please. And mitigation request. Now, this on the left, sorry, we've got a couple of messages that are, again, the schema type of message. And on the right, we've actually got how we see it going. So you have the signal channel is active. This kind of carries on to the previous representation. You have heartbeats going, and then a DDoS occurs, and the next heartbeat contains a mitigation request. The server then responds with a mitigation pending because the server has to respond. If that gets through, the client will send another one. Will keep sending requests until it actually is activated or refused. In this way, we feel that if any messages are lost, the client's not going to just stop doing stuff. It's going to keep doing stuff. And once the mitigation is actually active, then the client will just back off and just start sending general regular heartbeats, and maybe the odd update request or something like that if it needs to. Next slide. Signal server feedback. The server will actually respond now and again with various bits and pieces that might be useful to the client during an attack. The event ID of the attack, whether it's enabled, not enabled, whatever, TTL of the attack that's remaining, the bytes dropped, BPS dropped, just standard stuff that you would create a pretty graph out of on the, on a dashboard somewhere. Next slide. Mitigation withdrawal is pretty straightforward. You send a message saying that the requested is false now, so it's just 0 instead of a 1, and then the server will respond just confirming that that's occurred, and then it'll do whatever it does from the mitigation standpoint. It'll redivert traffic back. It'll give you, say you can change your IP address back on your DNS, whatever occurs. Next one, and that's it. So, any questions? Was it that clear?
Andrew Mortensen, one of the co-authors here. One of the things we were trying to do was provide an alternative to the more or less REST-based drafts that we'd seen so far. The idea here was really that the DOTS client is sort of emitting an emergency beacon continually. If it's a need of mitigation, it's continually saying, I need mitigation, just at the heartbeat interval. The server then is sending a heartbeat with information about what it's done in response to that beacon for help. And it just sort of is this ongoing relationship between them, both of them just indicating what needs, the client indicating what needs it has, the server indicating at the heartbeat interval what it's done in response to that.
Cool. Great, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And actually, I found it quite useful to see the messages. It was good. Yeah.
Okay, so next up, Frank.
Okay, hello everyone. It's Frank Xia, Huawei. This document is about the telemetry part of the DOS protocol. So it's co-authored by some of our network device vendors and the network operators. Okay, next page. Okay, firstly, we want to give a clear definition of what is the telemetry definition in scope of the DOS working group. Okay, so the DOS telemetry is defined as a collection of attributes which characterize the actual attack and the normal baseline of the attack, and they are useful to detect the DDoS attack and to mitigate them. So here there are 2 points. When the attack happened, this telemetry information or functionality can help us to get better visibility of the current attack. And also the normal baseline is also very useful because only after we construct a normal baseline, so it is very essential to help us to detect when the anomaly things happen in the network. So the telemetry can be used in this kind of situation. So, but it is from our view, it is not the mandatory attributes for the DOS signaling. It's just some useful and optional attributes that can be used. Okay, and so we have listed some of the limits or some of the constraints when we use these DOS telemetries. So firstly, it is optional. It is not mandatory. And the secondary is hints. It's not just some compulsory attributes that must send or must follow. And thirdly, it should not influence DOS signals reliability and efficiency. We know that when the attack happened, the message should be sent very reliably, very efficiently. So that means that DOS telemetry should be a very complex or very much information to influence the very high efficient DOS signaling. Okay, that's some constraints of it. Next slide. Okay, so in this page, I just want to clarify some basic reason why we need DOS telemetries as a complementary part of the DOS signaling. So firstly, we know that current DOS attack is very has a lot of complex characteristic. Yeah, so it's multi-vector, it's complicated, and it's mutual. So we really need to have a very comprehensive visibility or knowledge about what is happening. So that's a basic background. So when we use the DOS telemetry, we can get better visibility of the DOS attack, and it can help us to improve our mitigation performance. So, whether in terms of the time, efficiency, accuracy, false negative, and other measurements, it's all useful. And the third part is that, as I had mentioned, the normal traffic baseline is very important for the detection of the attack when it really happens. So it means that we can use the telemetry information during the peacetime to construct some normal network traffic condition. Because this condition is also mutable, changed by the time, by the network traffic, and by the traffic pattern and the network behavior. So there cannot be a global and very stable normal baseline here. So it depends on your continuous learning and construct this baseline.
I just wanted to ask a question. One of the earlier slides says these are optional. Here it's describing the baseline as indispensable. I just ask if you would describe or go into some of the contrast there. Why is it indispensable?
I don't mean that it's indispensable for all the DDoS attack. It's for the anomaly detection. For anomaly detection, the normal method is that we need to have a normal condition of network. So the telemetry can be used for this construction. Then we can detect some deviation from the normal condition. So that's an attack.
Roland Evans, Rubber Networks. I just want to point out that while anomaly detection and baselining and all that is extremely useful in the context of delimited DDoS attacks, it also doesn't matter in the context of delimited DDoS attacks. There's traffic that's obviously pathological. I don't know, SynFlood is a very simple example of that. So I guess my question here, more than anything else, I mean, we're starting to get into more specifics of detection, classification, traceback, right? And into these different devices and systems that often have radically different capabilities, radically different paradigms. Why is it that we believe that all of this necessarily belongs in DOTS? And are the authors of this draft saying that they believe that this is a baseline requirements for DOTS, or this is something
No,
that's
it's not
nice
baseline.
it's a nice to have that we can work on in later phases?
I think, yeah, good question. I think Fleming has do a very good summary in his information model draft. We have three part of the information model. The first one is a mandatory baseline for the DDoS signaling, and the second one is optional baseline functionality or information for the DDoS attack detection. So I think if we can keep our telemetry information part to be a minimal side and to be really useful, and it is a modular design. So that should be at the optional part. And we also do not want to propose a lot of attributes for DOS, because that's very very difficult. But that can be some extension. That should be the third part. So, yeah.
Forgive me. To clarify, I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
What we're saying here is that none of this in this draft is the authors don't consider it to be mandatory. They consider it to be optional. Everything in this draft, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. It is written in my first slide. It's optional. Yeah. Okay. So, but it's it is helpful to optimize the mitigation service. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Another reason is that sometimes the single individual DOS client cannot get the overview view of the network condition. So when we use this DOS telemetry information, and we have the DOS server to get several multiple telemetry information from different location, it can get better visibility of what really happening in the network. So that's also another reason. And the last reason is that this telemetry information is used for the mutual direction. So that means that it is very helpful for the whole DOS system to have a closed loop to help whether it's the DOS client or the DOS server. They are very clear know the current condition, and they can turn their activity to based on what they are known. So yeah, that's another reason. So that's why we think that telemetry can be used here as an optional attribute. Next slide. Okay, here is just some example of the telemetry information. It's not very clear now. Maybe some of them need more discussion. Maybe it's not so right now. Yeah, but we will later update this part. For example, we can see that we divided the telemetry information into based on the time into different part. First part is a pre-mitigation telemetry attribute. That's what I called in the peacetime how we use the information to construct the normal network baseline, or transmit another useful information. Okay, and then for the client to server, it includes the attack details and the current total traffic volumes information. They are all helpful. And the server to client, it also can send some telemetry information. So the point is that for all these telemetry informations, I think modularity modularity. Sorry. Okay, modularity. So it means that we must design it very carefully to make it to be more minimal, to be constructed easily and flexibly, and to not influence the basic baseline, no mandatory baseline information, and the extensibility, and it should. And the last feature is sufficiency, which means that we also do not want to hope this telemetry information to be so many, but it must be some very useful optional information. Yeah, please.
Barry Green Akamai. Deja vu, isn't this IODEF?
No, it's not IODEF. IODEF is
so
used.
what I'd like to see is a contrast, because I'd see
Yes,
a lot,
some of them.
I can do this, a lot of this in IODEF, so that's why I'd like to see a contrast of,
Yeah.
are we duplicating something that's already been complete?
Maybe some of attributes overlap. Yeah, but it's not IODEF.
Roland Dobbins, Arbor Networks. So, when looking at these different attributes, right? Again, I believe that generally speaking, that we want to make sure that DOTS applies to a wide range of deployment scenarios, wide range of architectures, wide range of devices, and so forth. But when I look at all of this is all very familiar because it seems oriented towards a particular paradigm of a DDoS mitigation, particular type of DDoS mitigation architecture. And so, when we look at, and then we look at baselines, for example, I mean, so when most people talk about baselines, they're thinking about like packets per second, bits per second, right? But in DDoS mitigation, it goes way beyond that. There's queries per second. There can be transactions per second, connections per second, right? What I'm trying to say here is that where this draft, and I read the draft in detail, it seems to be oriented towards a particular paradigm for DDoS mitigation, and this is potentially a very broad topic, and so I just want to really urge caution in general. We need to think about, does this sort of thing belong in DOTS at all, or should it be done in other ways?
No.
Okay.
I think they definitely part of them should be in DOS. Maybe not all of them, but some of them should be in DOS, because we try to collect, or we try to propose the telemetry information which is optional and which is useful for DOS signaling to help the DOS system to detect the attack.
Nick?
Yeah. Hi, Nick Teague. I sort of agree that it is paradigm specific, and I know which paradigm. But I would say that if you want to exchange this information, I think it's fine. I think there's certain things that I have a problem with what you've represented in the use of baselines, because again, connections per second, all this type of stuff. Are you doing sessions, all this type of terminology? A baseline could be any number of things based upon what you're trying to do. It could be total traffic. It could be just traffic to a particular server. It could be traffic through there. Things like pipe capacity. Is that pipe capacity through the inline device? Is it through across an entire site? Is it across an entire infrastructure? Pipe capacity could be anything from like 2 terabits to 1 gig. It's such a varying term. And also, I was curious about the Ceph definition as well, because Ceph is kind of in my head tied to syslog, which again probably goes along with the paradigm. But it's like I was thinking it's it's just pipe delimiting really is all you're doing with Ceph. But yeah, that's my comments.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe current text, because it is 0.0 version. So I also emphasize that this is just some examples of our very initial idea. Maybe we need to provide more clear and justifiable examples.
And if I may interject, actually, Nick just provided a couple of ideas how to further enrich it.
Yeah.
So this might be good feedback to integrate.
Yeah, I will look for you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Sorry.
You can rock.
Chris Morrow, Google. This sounds, a lot of the discussion here in the paper or draft, it sounds like it's a question about using common carriage, right? we have this DOTS thing, we have a client, we have relays and servers and gateways and this and that and mitigation providers, and we have all this stuff hooked up, right? Why don't we just jam more crap down that pipe, right? Because it's already there and it's convenient and it's all people talking about the same stuff. So it's a common carriage question for me. And this is a lot like people want to put more stuff in BGP or more stuff in DNS. Like the stuff is already there, so let's just use it. I think the question you should ask is it okay to do that for this as a secondary optional thing? Perhaps. Or should we rely on existing infrastructure that already does this to take over that effect, right? I mean, I think the original concept for DOTS was very small, very simple, very cheap. Tell somebody I need help. That's it. I don't care about all the rest of this stuff. Like, because honestly, as an insight, none of this shit can you tell in any reasonable fashion anyway, right? You just can't. So not reliably. So I think it's easier to say, thanks, audio engineer. I appreciate your help in this matter. Look, I can even tip it down now. Okay. So at the end of the day, should DOTS do this or not? In my opinion, it should still maintain very short, small, quick, easy, cheap. I think this is a lot more than that, but you know, maybe there are people who want it. I think it's optional. We can sort that problem out much later, right? It's down the road.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. I understand your mean.
So-
Yeah. I disagree that the DOS should be basically should be a very simple call-for-help protocol. Yeah. What we propose is not, we don't want to make DOS complicated. We just want to make DOS more useful for some special cases.
Yeah.
You know,
so-
it's when
right,
we, yeah.
right. So-
Actually, we don't think we have confliction. Yeah.
No, yeah, I'm not necessarily trying to raise conflict. And if you looked at like Nick's proposal of just use protobufs, you just slap a whole bunch more stuff on there that people just don't have to care about, right? I don't care about all these other.
Yeah, you
attributes
can
of
use the
protobuf.
minimal set of the protocol. Yeah, that's okay.
You can put 100 things in a protobuf, and if I only care about
No.
I don't care
It's
about
not
Guys,
the.
guys, this is not so much a dialogue.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Roman, as a participant.
On my tippy toes. Roman Danilo, cert. I had a question about how you would frame all of this information. I'm just thinking back to the architecture draft. I mean, the two choices now are data channel, signal channel. Where do you envision putting in? Is there a third channel? Is it split
No.
between the channels?
Yeah. We do not need third channel. We still use the data channel and the signal channel. For example, in the peacetime, we can use the data channel. Yeah, to transfer some telemetry information. When the attack happen, maybe the signal channel is more suitable. Yeah, it depends on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd recommend making that a little clearer in the draft.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Again, I think maybe this example not very good to clarify our idea, but we do think that if we can find some minimal set of telemetry information, it really can help our DDoS attack. Okay. The next slides. Okay. This slide is just some example, some use case. It mainly says that how we use the telemetry in the peacetime to construct the normal baseline, and when we find something abnormal, we can use this normal baseline to and use the telemetry information to help us with the ability of the attack in network. And yeah, that's about this page. Okay, next page. So summary. So we have. So actually, this is a zero version. It's brought by some of our network device vendors. So our main objective is we just want to bring some more discussion to working group about the DOS telemetry part. So because we have find that there's various needs and various needs for this information, it can be useful, and we want to discuss together with you about how to use them for optimizing our DOS mitigation, and also a very important point is that how to differentiate between the current and the minimal mandatory baseline and the extend optional baseline information. So that's some key problem, and we have some suggestions. Firstly, we think that current use case draft is not very enough to include the telemetry information. Maybe our draft, some of our draft text can contribute to it to enrich the part of telemetry related items. And for the future protocol extensionality, extensibility, we think that maybe individual solution draft for telemetry information maybe is useful. Yeah, let's see. Okay.
I'm closing the mic after Roland.
Barry Green, Akamai, a question for working group chairs. Is this an adopted draft into the working group?
I'm sorry, what
Is this draft adopted into the working group?
Actually, if you look, most of the drafts are not adopted at this stage.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Because my concern with this is that your aspirations with this draft, which is to incorporate this within the signal and data of DOTS, is going to add, even if you say, oh, it's just optional, means that the signal and data has to accommodate this. So this is going to add a level of complexity that is going to digress from the goals of it.
Yeah.
And I don't think about debating it now. I think you have to really support, you really have to show how you're going to maintain the simplicity where we know you can start going through all the past work of how you move telemetry around the network. It's not a simple task.
Yeah, I understand.
Right? So you're going to have to support that.
Yeah, okay. I want to say that I think our DOS protocol solution should have some capability negotiate functions beforehand. So, which means that after the negotiation, if that is not needed.
People don't hear you at the mic if you say it in the room. Roland?
Because
excuse me. How are we on time?
We'll get those 2 questions.
Yeah.
They have to be quick.
Yeah, we take 2 questions and then maybe you give an answer, but not.
Okay. My comment here is that I believe that this telemetry discussion needs to be maintained for purposes of clarity, and having a thorough discussion of this topic needs to be maintained in a separate draft and should not be combined with the use cases draft at this time.
Fleming Andreas, just want to point out that the charter does talk about telemetry. I don't think it's clear about exactly what that means. Maybe we need clarity on that.
So yes, thank you. Yes, it does. Yeah. Frank, you have any comments before we close?
Oh, I have.
You have one more?
Okay. No.
You're finished.
Yeah.
Okay,
finished.
good.
Yes.
Okay, good spirited discussion. We'll have a little bit more time at the open mic if we can keep to the schedule. So next up is Fleming. You're gonna slide in to do this talk.
Fleming Andreasen. So none of the authors of this draft was able to make it to the meeting, so they asked if I could present here. Tiro, I believe, is actually in the Meet Echo session, so you can still ask tough questions, and Tiro will be more than happy to answer all of them. This presentation is for the 02 version of the signal channel draft. If you've been keeping up, then you will notice that there is at least an 04 version out there right now. So there's a couple of changes, and they're not reflected in here. So I just want to point that out for people. Next slide. This is basically the outline of what we're going to cover, which is essentially the changes from 01 to 02. So there was some additional information about how you deal with session configuration. We agreed that that would be done as part of the signal channel right now. So we'll talk about discover, configure, retrieve, and delete. Redirected signaling support was added in here as well. Just a quick update of some proof of concept that Tiro has done, and then quickly around security and the use of TLS or DTLS 1.3. Next slide, please. So this is showing how you would essentially figure out what are some of the configuration parameters that are being supported. If you recall, this particular signal channel proposal uses CoAP. So that's what you see here, a GET request that is asking for the acceptable configuration parameters. Here you see heartbeat interval, max retransmit, and act timeout with essentially range values in there. Next slide. Here we are talking about the session configuration, actually getting that put in place. So there is a post request that is being submitted there that provides the configuration data parameters, and that of course should align with whatever was actually supported, unless you already knew that. You can obtain that information as well later on, and you can remove the configuration as well if you want to. Next slide. You can of course encounter error scenarios. 422 is going to be returned in that particular case, and the server can essentially provide you with information about what are the supported values using the same parameters as you saw before. Next slide. Redirected signaling support was added in here, and we had some discussions previously around should we try caching DNS, because again, under attack scenarios, if we do redirection, what about DNS resolution, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a little bit of machinery in there to deal with that. You will provide a DNS name or an IP address, and if you're not able to resolve it, there is essentially some IP address information that is included for you as well that you can use as a last resort. And it's not trying to, of course, override any kind of DNS data that you normally have, but this is a fallback mechanism if you're not able to resolve those DNS queries. Next slide. Proof of concept here, as I mentioned, Zero has implemented some of this to make sure it actually works. You can see the references here using the Californium framework, essentially for CoAP. In the Mozilla browser, there is a plugin that you can install, Copper Framework, that will enable you to actually play around with some of these messages and, input parameters, see what they actually look like. Next slide. Here is an example, and again, I should point out that this is the O2 version of the draft. So what you will see in here is specifically, if you look at the payload, you will see JSON. The latest version of the draft has actually changed that to CBOR. But this is essentially an example of what one of these messages would look like. Finally, on the security part, so recommendation in here, or the specification, is essentially that we will be using TLS or DTLS 1.3. A couple of benefits to that, of course, the reduced number of handshakes to begin with, but probably the most important one is the zero RTT resumption using the pre-shared keys. So especially, for example, if the signal channel disappears and you need to reestablish it, or you are redirected, and you are redirected to an entity within the same domain that is essentially using the same pre-shared key, everything will still work, right? Even if you're under attack, then you can't actually do bidirectional signaling. I think that's covered here in terms of some of the benefits, both peacetime-wise and attack time-wise. Next slide. And that is it for the update. So any comments or questions? Again, I want to emphasize that this is really just talking about what has changed between 01 and 02. Obviously, I mean, if people want to know more about the overall solution, look at the draft. Questions, comments, feedback? All right.
Wow. Okay. That's no feedback. Okay. No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not pushing you. Okay. This is not a. And to Tiro Online. So if you have something to add, you can do so, because we actually have Meet Echo here with remote speaker capability. Okay. But with no further questions, then we move to the next, which gives us more time for discussion later. And that is Bob for DOTS identities.
Thank you. Thank Andy and Fleming for actually giving me points on their slides to lead into my slides. So what's the problem? In DOTS requirements, Security 01 says peer mutual authentication. And most IETF protocols rely on public key signing to perform mutual authentication. We really don't know how to do mutual authentication without public key signing, to be frank about that. There are two models pretty much present for public key signing. Either you have a full X509 certificate with all that entails, or you have some raw public key methodology. Again, we have protocols supporting both. Finally, additionally, machines are not good at interacting with the certificate authority. Registration systems are designed for people, not so much for machines. and even those are manually tested for a person to install a certificate into a machine. So the question comes up is how to scale and manage and to trust the identities. So what's needed? A certificate enrollment process, machine-oriented, but associated with the business subscription process, support for devices that can't or won't support full X509, whether those small devices will be present in DOTS landscape, I don't know, but we should accommodate them. Business-specific PKI along with web-trusted list model. As I mentioned, I came to the mic earlier, I am a strong believer in a business-specific PKI, but I will admit that some people in their business will not want to go that way, so the document will need to, in the end, support both. And then an interbusiness trust modeling as well. So the draft status, lots of placeholders that only I know about. Hey, it's a 00 draft, and there's a lot of stuff I just didn't get the time to put in there yet. Updated draft well before the interim call, and it's open to other contributors. Okay. So what is in the draft? Let's get down to the basics here. It's heavily biased toward the IEEE 802.1AR device certificate standard. The reason for that is many vendors are implementing TPM and 802.1AR in the devices for other reasons. I know this is not across the board, but I take this as a starting point because there is work in other areas for affordable trust store because TPMs are not cheap. And we're having this in many other arenas where there's a push for mobile TPMs, low-cost TPMs, and the rest of it. Some safe store for those private keys where they'll be safe. It also gets into code signing issues and other related things. There are some attempts at enrollment here in the IETF. We have Brewski over in Anima, and we have ZeroConf over in RESTConf. And there's, of course, there's 70-30 enrollment over secure transport. And then you go to the old PKIC stuff way back if you so want. The intention of a single PKI per DOTS provider. And support for the raw public key methods as well. What is not yet in the draft? Complete certificate enrollment process. 802.1AR certificates and others. I do plan on pursuing this. I've had a lot of discussions prior to getting this draft I need to get in. Plus, I've reviewed this, the Zero Touch draft. I do not feel it's really applicable, but it may be a good starting point. And inter-provider trust model. I prefer the Bridge CA model because I invented it back in '97 as a way to establish trust between multiple PKIs. But Dane has been mentioned. I have problems with its span of trust and control of trust. Same way I have problems with managing a trust list. But I will try to cover the pros and cons of all these different approaches. Recommendations on LDAP or other trusted lists for how you manage the list of, if you're not going to have your own business PKI, how you will trust all the certificates you get from other places that you say, yes, this is a trusted entity I want to deal with, even though I do not control their trust assertion. And of course, raw public keys, you need some sort of method of managing them in a workable, scalable model. And there's probably other stuff which I haven't listed here that I will need to put into it. So this is a work in progress. And just a placeholder. We do, as we mentioned, we really need the ability to identify these devices for lots of reasons. First step, how do you establish mutual authentication in any of our protocols? Whether you use TLS, DTLS, IPsec, XYZ, we all know that we've gone down this road. You need a way to sign those exchanges to establish the trust. And then we need the identities for when you get into the business about who is it that actually called for help, how to identify that call for help. How far we'll go down into that data modeling. Will we make any recommendations along that way? There are privacy concerns, as our AD said, but inside the business model, you need to know who called for help. It's a question then how you may mask that call if you need to pass that information over to one of your business mitigation partners in terms of actually like who you're helping. So next slide. So next steps will be to rev the draft as soon as I can get round to it in the next couple of weeks. And then get the draft accepted by the working group, because I do feel this is a critical item. And that really completes my presentation.
Tobias Gondrom, working group chair head of. So this is interesting, but I'm a little bit not clear why this should be in DOTS. So I can see, there's some constraints in the PKI infrastructure, but this doesn't only apply to our DOTS client server situation. This applies generally. So I'm not quite clear why you want this to be done here. Maybe you can enlighten me.
I will. Anima work is concerned about getting a device onto a specific network. How do I establish trust in a particular network that now the 802.1x registration, the rest is going to work? That's what Brusky is dealing with. It's very small environment. Zero touch may have some implications in here. Zero touch is more inside a particular control domain of an enterprise or a service provider, and where they own those devices and how they are establishing trust in the model. Here, we may have the first case of devices in an inter-organizational communication and how this then scales up yet to the next step. So I'm talking about a layered sort of issue and those of us who have lived 802.1ar and these discussions, we've had these discussions for maybe 10 years and how these things work or could work, but we've never really designed the protocols to and the process to actually do this. So why here? You're first on the block.
Roland Dobbins, Arbor Networks. Forgive me if this is a stupid or naive comment because I'm straying beyond my area of alleged expertise here. But I believe that we envisage, and this is not intended, to be a limiting factor, but we envisage that a lot of DOTS deployments, at least initially, will be using pre-shared keys, shared secret type of deployment. And I'm not trying to obviate, PKI and registration and all that kind of stuff, but that's something to keep in mind.
I fully understand that there is a lot of manual deployment, of manually putting in keys, from security hat on. That's not something I'm going to necessarily put in standard unless I have some way to change them.
Hi, Nick Teague. So I find it very interesting. I would echo what Tobias said as far as I think it's not just in DOTS, but I also would mention that you use the word device a lot, and TPM and everything else is relevant to devices and stuff. But if I'm sitting there writing an open source application, DDoS mitigation application, and I've downloaded protobufs, because I like the idea, and I downloaded, and I'm using REST and everything else. How can I then play in this sphere? It's creating a very high bar for me to then be able to even do this, whereas I just want to be able to spend a bit of time, read the spec, push it into perspective, and then that's the way I want to go. This is far too heavy for what I would want to do in that context. I just wanted to make that clear. I think from a vendor perspective and everything else, if we're already doing TPM, why not just do other TPM? But it's or more with it and stuff. But I think but again, I would echo what Tobias said as far as maybe this needs to be something else. But I don't disagree that it's relevant. But
to your questions, Nick, 2 points. One, there is work on something called mobile TPM. and how that may or may not work in terms of self-implementations and the challenges inherent therein. There will be specifically a section in there when there is no device root to build from. And how do you get the certificate when you have no device root to build from? And to go from there, and how you do the assertion of ownership and the rest of it. ZeroConf has the same sort of issues that they're dealing with there. So it's not an uncommon one, and we know we have to, it's not one we like to do, but we know within reality we have to do.
Tobias Gondrum again, not as working group chair. So, I can see that maybe the drafts don't answer yet well about authentication. And I can see a need to address that authentication question. I also can see that maybe we are the first down the block, as you describe it from your thing. Now, for a minute, to put the working group chair head on, it scares me to take something on that is beyond the objective of DOTS. Like this, yes, we are the first on the block, but it will be like you target more than DOTS, much more, if this looks very much like a generic approach. So yeah, as working group chair, I feel a little bit, this is not so good. But equally, I also appreciate that maybe there's no other place. So, but let me conclude as working group chair. I'm very reluctant. I feel very reluctant to take something on just because we're the first down the block. I don't think that's a strong argument. But this is just my humble personal stage at this moment. Thank you.
As initial step, I may say, I start here, I take it here, I meet the DOTS requirement, and here comes maybe our AD to chime in terms of where we may go from here.
So Kathleen Moriarty, AD. I think you should continue working on this, Robert, and I don't know where it will land. For the DOTS working group, I'm going to have to see what the proposal is for your authentication so that we're not winding up with something that's going to get stopped in the IESG That's one of my concerns if it's not good enough. I just came from a depressing meeting this morning on the state of security in several different areas from things, and designing things well is important.
Given whatever XYZ protocol we choose for protecting the communications, those protocols will have a setup process. For them to be successful in meeting our goals, they'll be having mutual authentications, which means some sort of identity, something that makes an attribution to a public-private key pair. And then how that process then gets enrolled, tying with the business model for those of us who lived the PKIX pain back then and all these discussions, how to skirt things through. I think we have a lot of lessons learned and how to get a document which could pass IESG review and be of value to DOTS. And again, whether it stays here in the end, that'll be up to the ADs and that. But I feel very strongly you shouldn't neglect it because it is bigger. You at least want to make sure that you have it in your hip pocket of how the stuff is going to go.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And we can continue talking about this topic or any topic at all. We're transitioning to the short open mic time that we have. So any comments,
Thank
concerns,
you all.
thoughts? Thank you, Bob.
Hi, Dave Dolson, Sandvine. I've been, just absorbing all these different protocol suggestions and looking at the, HTTP and so on. And one thing that strikes me is that the session layer or the channels add a lot of complexity. So I was trying to find in the requirements of the architecture why there was a session layer that, and I was wondering if someone could answer that, as opposed to just a message, RESTful type of messages. So if it's not clear, by session layer, I mean the part about, open connection, sequence numbers on every message, that ride over top of the transport. So we're adding like, it seems a bit like a transport on top of a transport. So anyway, maybe someone could.
Bob Moskowitz, we're really getting perhaps into a meta discussion here, and something which I feel extremely strong about being around here for a long time, the IETF, that the IETF has basically lied to itself that it doesn't have a session layer. Almost every single thing we have done in the IETF has created its own session layer for what it needs to do, and copied in some cases from what others have done and lessons learned, but the decision for good or for bad, because those of us who used to gossip a lot, OSI really didn't understand what session was to be, and so the founders of TCP/IP says, let's forget about it for now, leaving it to every single application to do it, and there's always a session. I can't even think of an application that really doesn't have a session. So yes, we're defining ours.
Fleming Andreas, I don't know if that is really just going to answer your question, but I mean, basically we have this notion that there is a service relationship between the DOTS client and the DOTS server, and you got to capture that somehow, right? So I do think you need some kind of session construct to encompass that. I mean, the alternative would be that you find a way of independently authenticate, everything without any kind of state, on a per message basis. I don't know if that's what you're alluding to. Maybe I don't really understand your question.
Well, I understand the idea that you kind of need to register a device so that when you come back later, you're aware of it. But it's actually, why can't it? I guess it just strikes me. My comment is that we'd probably be done by now if we could just, encompass the basic "I need help" message in something and say "I need help," and so. But instead, and I think there's going to be a lot of time spent trying to iron out all the wrinkles in the session layer, the open, the close, and the sequence numbers. So
so Fleming, so I think the problem with that is, all right, so you need help, right? Who are you? Why should I help you? What do you need help with? And, why are you authorized to ask for help with this stuff, right? There's all these questions that come up, right? And that's where having this session notion, I think, helps address some of those.
We have surprisingly a person coming to the mic in the Meet Echo queue, and I'm gonna press the red button now and see what happens.
Testing.
Yes,
Testing.
we hear you.
Oh, very good. Hello.
We
my
hear
name
you.
is Gilbert Clark. I just wanted to ask real quick about the NetConf and the RESTConf conversation a little bit, because that actually came as a little bit of a shock. I was a little bit concerned by an understanding that maybe there was a proposal to use that as a signaling protocol or something along those lines. That to me was very, very surprising, and I didn't really understand where that came from, or what. I was hoping maybe somebody could give me a little bit of enlightenment.
Thank you. And we're closing the mic at this point.
Bob Moskowitz, as a contributor to Sue Hare's work, in specifically, NetConf is adding a notification process that came out of I2RS. If you look at what that is, that maps closely to the signaling channel. That's that particular conversation. It's not what in the past NetConf has done, but rather its adoption of I2RS. So I'll just leave it at that for this discussion.
Hi,
Nick, could I just interrupt you for a second? Nick, where are the blue sheets? Perfect. Can you send them up? Thanks. Sorry, Nick.
Hi, Nick Teague. I would disagree that the notification in NetConf actually does anything that the signaling channel does, and I would strongly not want to ever use NetConf for signaling in this instance, especially. Is my opinion. I think it came up because of, from what I can gather, it's a way of looking at a common kind of substrate underlay for a few different projects that seem to be going on, and it would tie them in so that you have basically one way of disseminating information, and then different bit models that would then sit on top of that, which is a noble effort. But I don't think that this is the the platform for that, because we could be here forever. And then when we do it, I can know a whole lot of people who won't use it. So that's my opinion.
Good. Thank you very much. We are at the end of our scheduled time. And
So I have a short summary of where we stand. So just as a reminder, we'll be putting a post out to the mailing list about what it would be the best time in late January, to schedule the virtual interim meeting. And as it relates to some of the drafts, just to reiterate, we ask that if you have more use cases that are not documented anywhere in writing, that you make it known in the next 6 weeks before the end of the calendar year. The team editing the requirements draft asked for some more review, but they think it's close, so please put some eyes on that. Likewise, on the architecture document, it needs more review, but the feeling is that it is also close, so please do read through that. And then we had a spirited conversation about the information model draft, and it looked from there that a lot more review is required, so that's again a place where we could really use your help. So with that, that's it for us. Thank you so much. We'll see you in Chicago and see you virtually in January. Safe travels to everyone.
yeah, safe travels. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Roland. Safe travels back. Yeah.